Message today, I'm going to begin a series on Esther. Now, you might wonder why we're doing Esther, and specifically at this time of the year, and it actually couldn't be any more appropriate. As we know, or may know, Purim is coming up, and again, let me just look at the dates here. It's going to be Wednesday, March 20th and 21st. The Jews will be celebrating that, and of course, that's just less than a week away. So it happens at this time of the year, and this is the setting and the cause for Purim to actually have come about, is the book of Esther, and we'll be getting to that as time goes along. But there's actually something else within Esther, in the middle of Esther, that I will be bringing to our attention, and it makes it even more appropriate for the season that we're about to enter in terms of God's festivals. Now, I don't want to give away that, and it probably won't be today that we get to it, but keep that in mind as we continue to move forward in this series. And I'm not exactly sure how long it's going to take, but we're going to continue through it, and it's going to be kind of our preparation as well for the season at hand. So first, just a little background on the book of Esther, as we normally do. Let me just tell you this first, okay, because we talk about one of the main characters is King Ahasuerus, right? Now, there's always this trying to marry up of Bible with archaeological facts and historical facts, and there's always this naysaying that goes back and forth about who these people are, or who they really are, or who they aren't, and people say, well, it couldn't be this or it could be that. And I think what happens, and can very well and very easily happen in the book of Esther, is for people to get caught up in the history of it and trying to make it marry up with secular sources as with the Bible. Now, it's very difficult, I think, at the best of times to do this because, as we'll see, and let me just read this to you real quick, the kings of Persia at the time, there were several of them that were named the same thing. And not only that, but they often had at least two names, if not more, and then different titles that went with them. Now, there was Cyrus the First, right? And I'm just going to go through these lists, and I don't want you to write it down or feel that you need to, but just understand how they go. And this is kind of our best understood order of them. And you can see why things can kind of get a little bit confused. So Cyrus II, the Great, there's Cambyses, then Pseudo-Smerdis is thrown in there very quickly. And then there's Darius I, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, Xerxes II, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, third and fourth, and then Darius III. So you see it kind of goes back and forth, a lot of the same names, and this can be part of the problem as to why, and then the reason I'm throwing this in is because of the naysayers. They're going to get out there and they're going to say, well, this happened or that happened. Well, as a word of caution, I want to say that if we delve too much into the what ifs and who this could be and all these types of things, I think we may be thrown off the track a little bit here and we'll miss what the story is trying to tell us. Of course, what we do already know is that God is true, there is a God, and the Bible is his word. And so we don't need to go through, after you've done those things, and prove that this is true, that this is supposed to be here. It is the word of God, and as we'll see God's hand definitely in this book. Even though, and here's what the naysayers, the first thing that they're going to bring up is that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. So this peculiarity has thrown a lot of people a curveball. So when it comes to the fact that he's not mentioned or prayer is not mentioned, they go, well, how could this be about God? But having read through it, and we've all done this, I think, probably once or twice already, and I would urge you to go through it again, you begin to see exactly how much God is really in the picture. So basically the way the book starts off is that, and again, it doesn't mention Darius, but Darius was the father, and he left his kingdom to one of the main characters, Ahasuerus. Now, the book of Esther picks up in the third year of Ahasuerus, who is also known as Xerxes. And it picks up in his reign. So the setting of the book is around 483 or 484 to 483, I should say it backwards, since we're moving towards zero. 484 to 483 BC, and we'll see this, and we'll go over this at the beginning as we go through the book of Esther verse by verse. So just to kind of set the scene, as you recall, the Jews went into captivity. They began to be taken into captivity around 604 BC, all the way down to about 585 BC or so, around there. And again, because these things are somewhat nebulous, I'm not going to say them and set them in stone. And this is kind of a backdrop to what we're going to be looking at today. But they went into captivity in Babylon around that time, and it was over the course of that time. And then 539 BC, Babylon fell. And most of history agrees with the fact that that was when it happened. And of course, it fell to the Medes and the Persians, who again, Artaxerxes, or Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, is king of that empire. Now, when Cyrus, who was the one that took over, again, you may remember this in Daniel, was that, and he was prophesied to do this, that when he took over Babylon, he took it over in a night, as the story goes. He then knew, again, by providence of God, that this happened, and that also that he was to allow the Jews to go home back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, right? So that was happening around 539 BC. Now, he allowed them to do that, but not all of the Jews decided to return. Many of them stayed in and amongst the lands of Persia, of the Persian Empire. And so now we have this book of Esther, that is taking place some 55 years after that happened and after the end of the Babylonian captivity. So the book of Esther is what's considered one of the scrolls, or the Megilloth. It's one of these books that the Jews read at certain times of the year. And this is the time of the year that the Jews always read the book of Esther. So there are the other books, and I won't bother going through them, but there's another 4 that are read at specific times of the year that are included in that grouping. But we'll see as we go through this book why the Jews read it at this time of the year. Now, as I said before, one of the main objections was that God is not in the book. There's no reference to him at all. Now, it seems like, and as you read through it a couple times and you keep asking yourself these questions, that this was done on purpose. Now, we don't know exactly why, and this is what I don't want to do, is get into the speculation, because I think it can detract from the book. But let's suffice it to say that it was probably on purpose. It seems like it was definitely on purpose. And it may be because of the audience that it was written to at the time, or the context in which it was written. But one of the other little things that people will bring up about God not being in it is that you can see an acrostic. Acrostic is having to do with the alphabet, or the first letters of certain letters of words that are brought in. And when you take them all, it spells out. Well, apparently in 2 different places, we find that the word for God is actually spelled out when using the end letters all in succession. So some people look at that as being evidence, and could definitely be because of the positioning of this and whatnot. But again, I don't want to detract from the actual message of the book, and we're already taking this as a foregone conclusion that it is supposed to be in the canon of the Bible, the books that are put in the Bible for us, and through these, all the lessons can be learned that we need to learn. It is clear that though direct references to God have been omitted or left out on purpose, or it was just the way that it was actually inspired, that this story has God's involvement written all over it. And the Jews consider this one of the greatest interventions of God in the lifetime of, in the history of Jews. So, as for the book, there's no explicit statement that is given as to who the author is, but as we'll go through, there might be a hint here or there that shows that it may have been Mordecai that was the one that has written it, because we see that from the very beginning and the very end, it does talk about some of these things in the past tense. So it seems like this was written after the fact, after Xerxes had died, and then that would have been around 464 BC. And then even after Mordecai has died, it seems like there might have been an epilogue that was added to the very end. But again, to dwell on these points, I think would do us a disservice and to take away from the overall message. So with that out the way, and we have this kind of setting and background for the history and whatnot, I think we have a good idea of where we're at. So let's go ahead and begin with Esther 1 and our verse by verse commentary. Esther 1 and verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, goes, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now, again, I'll just mention this real quick because I think we do need to be prepared to a certain degree for the onslaughts that will come as people figure out this little thing here or there that they think that they've discovered that now makes their position on the Bible unassailable. But if you look at some place like the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says that Darius, his father, had set up only 20 satraps. All right, so 20 governors in the empire, and here we have, he died, I think, in the midst of this great campaign that he was making, and he left it to Ahasuerus or Xerxes, and he then is said to have had 127 provinces. So again, people want to get all hooked up on these types of things, and they again, to me, the simple explanation, and specifically, even the word here for province is not the same word as a satrap or satrapy. And so, again, it could easily just be a division of each satrap, which was typically a governor over a region. And so if the regions were divided up into 6 or 7 parts, it would easily explain why this is. And it's definitely not something to get hooked up on. So verse 2, it says, in the days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which is in Shushan, the citadel. So Shushan is modern day Susa. They have 5,000 years of history there. This is a very common knowledge, and most people know that, again, it's Susa in Iran, which is also known as Persia. I've dealt with Iranians before, and they've referred to themselves, even to this day, as Persians. But it's situated all the way over on the western border, up against Iraq, but obviously still in Iran. And it's, again, can be seen, this actual place still exists today, obviously not in the splendor that it existed back then. So continuing in verse 3, that in the 3rd year of his reign, so we have timing here, and again, we can go back in history and you can see these dates I was telling you about before, as to when he actually began his reign, and so where that puts the 3rd year of his reign. So in this year, he made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, or the Medes, the nobles, the princes of the provinces being before him. So here we are again, 484 to 483 BC. And I think it gives us a certain amount of perspective that we'll be calling back and referencing in terms of the book and perhaps, what was going on in the certain mindsets and whatnot. Verse 4. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So again, the 6 months, 6 times 30 is 180 days. Now it's interesting that it was a part of their culture then, and it still seems to be a part of their culture now. This wanting to show off. Let me show off what we have. When I think of where I've grown up in the culture that I've lived and the years that I've lived, I don't ever remember us doing that anywhere around here where you're showing off all the splendor of, say, your military. Again, it seems like a lot of foreign countries do this where they have these big parades. In Iran, just this year alone is no exception. Here we are, Persia, all these years later, so we're talking almost 2,500 years later, we have Persia still doing the same thing here. And just in this year alone, they've showed off their military by showing off their destroyers, some of their missiles and rockets and submarines with new capabilities, and even most recently, some of their drones, which, again, they're pointing towards Jerusalem. And the hatred that they have for it is obviously being directed that way. And that's yet another story in terms of what we're talking about. But at this time, there is an amicable relationship, for the most part, between the Persians and the Jews that are scattered among their region. So continuing in verse 5, and when these days were completed, the ones of the feasting, the king made a feast, another one, lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, or the actual, how would you say, reinforced kind of center of the city that, where the king lived and people would come. And so it was also the center of government as well. From great to small, in the court of the garden in the king's palace, there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a, it says, mosaic pavement, which I kind of have to smile that they're mentioning. It's kind of some type of mosaic, which comes, I think, from the word Moses. Should have looked that up before, but again, it's not even a real word there, but it's kind of inserted as understood. A mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white and black marble. So the point here, in addition to just all the wealth that was there at that time, and again, this is nothing that's shocking, and it's something that has always existed from one empire to the other, is this gathering of riches, and a lot of it's taken from the empire that's before you. But what this shows is that whoever's writing this has a familiarity with the inside of the palace, where not just everyone was allowed to go. So this person that's giving it has insider information. And if indeed it is Mordecai, he was right there and saw these things and was able to, write them out for our sake now to a great extent and to a great detail to show us exactly what it was like on the inside. Now, verse 7, it says they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. And so again, he was being very generous and showing off his wealth. And he even had these custom-made drinking vessels where no two were alike. Continuing in the first chapter of Esther, verse 8. Now, in accordance with the law, okay, again, we'll focus on that here in just a bit. The drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. So he did not force them to drink. So it was not an insult to him or to anyone else if they didn't drink, or if they drank just a little, or if they just did not get blindingly drunk. So they want to make the point, though, that in accordance with the law, this was allowed at this point in time. Now, verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So, like even today, back then, the women of their time were in submission or subservient to the men. And now they weren't placed a long ways away. They were still in the castle. They still had a certain amount of position and I guess respect among other women, as it were. But it was still separate from the men and what the men were doing. But nonetheless, they were at the same time allowed to have their feast that was going on concurrently, just separately. Now, Esther 1, verses 10 through 12. Now, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded these 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So here we have, again, at the beginning of this verse, and we're not going to try to, it's another situation where we're not going to try to read too much into it. We're not going to suppose what many different people have supposed happened at this time, and it's all conjecture. We don't know. And if it was imperative that we know, then we would know. But the emphasis here seems to be on the fact that there were 7 days of drinking before the king made his request. How does it put it? The king was merry with wine after these 7 days. So he's been doing this for 6 months. And now here's another 7 days. And then he makes a request that I'm sure was commensurate with the amount of inebriation that he was now having. So here he is, he's drunk, and now he's got this bright idea to make this request. And as king, his word was law. And he makes the request. But for some reason, Vashti refused. So we see that he wanted to show her off in verse 11. And she was no doubt very beautiful. And we'll even see the extent to which he goes to make sure that he has a beautiful wife here in the future. But no doubt she was, how can we say in their terms, prized among all the women that he had the opportunity to take as a wife. But for some reason, okay, again, don't want to speculate, but she refused. That was a no-no in terms of the king's word. So when the king spoke, it was law, and she refused. Now, whether right or wrong, we're not debating, but the fact is that you have this convergence of events that take place where a situation occurs, and now we have a confrontation that needs to be reconciled. And as we read through this, we understand that God's hand is in all these things, and it was not for no reason that this occurred. So continuing in verse 13 and 14, he's got to come up with a way to handle this, and perhaps even save face among the other princes and nobles that were with him. So then, verse 13, the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. So there's some type of adjudication that needs to take place. Those closest to him being the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's present and who ranked highest in the kingdom. These were his top advisors. Perhaps, we could look at it in terms of a cabinet, in terms of our terms here. Continuing in verse 15, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey? She did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. So then it seems, though, that the princes may have their own agenda, and they're going to make the most of this opportunity. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, so he's kind of playing up to him, it seems, but also all the princes, all of us as well, and all the people who are in the provinces throughout the empire. Okay, so now it's all of a sudden like the sky is falling down here. He goes, for the queen's behavior will become known to all the women, so that they will all despise their husbands in their eyes. And when the report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, and she did not come, then the sky falls in, and this very day the nobles, ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath for the men. So now, whether they had some other agenda or not, and again, this would call for speculation, and we don't exactly know who Vashti was, or what kind of character or person she was, or even exactly who she was in history, or why they might have wanted this done. Nonetheless, they go ahead and take it to the extreme and say, this is bad, this is very bad. Not only has she insulted you, she has insulted us, and she's insulted all the men of this kingdom. We cannot have that. So verse 19, if it pleases the king. Now, I've said all that, but if you want to do this, King Ahasuerus, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered. that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So again, we see this mentality, this set of rules, the way that they, again, made rules and lived by them within the kingdom of the Persians and Medes. And that was that once a law was made, it could not be countermanded. It could not be altered. Again, there's an instance of that as well over in Daniel 6, verses 8 through 17, if you want to look there some other time. But in that instance, we see that they couldn't find fault with Daniel. Again, this was with the Persian after the Babylonians had been taken over, and he was a part of that kingdom, and he had risen among the men there, and they did not like that, so they tried to find fault. They couldn't find fault with him, and because they couldn't find fault, they made up a law that was in direct contravention to the laws that Daniel kept, the law of God. And when he broke their law and continued to keep God's law, then they finally said, aha, we got him. And they brought it to the king and said, well, look, it's the law of the Medes and Persians. You have to live by it. You can't alter it. And even though the king didn't want to do this and send him to the lion's den, he was forced to do it because it was inalterable, and not even the king could change it once he made this statement, proclamation, decree. And again, it puts it in a very set in stone place. And so we're seeing this here, okay, setting the tone for a law that's going to be sent out here in the future. But what we see, though, is that once it's put in motion, it cannot be changed. So this one towards Vashti now is set in motion. She's no longer a queen. So there is then going to be a process for finding a new queen. So what we're beginning to see, and having read this story, we're seeing God's hand become more evident, perhaps now that we've read through it again. So when we look at this the first time, we go, well, I don't necessarily see something. But when we read this last line again, it says, in her royal position to another who is better than she. We see then now this chain of events that are happening that, again, God is orchestrating, he's intervening in, so that the way can be made for another. Now, continuing in verse 20, Esther 1, verses 20 through 22. So when the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, again, it extended all the way to the Mediterranean, down to Ethiopia, all the way over to India, and even kind of northeast and beyond a little bit of modern day India. And again, he's sending this out because it's a law. He's got to send it out to everyone. And what's going to be proclaimed is all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, so that there's not going to be an issue or problem with this. It's going to be written in a language that you can understand. And to every people in its own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So now the decree became inviolable. It was the law of the land. And now the search is on for someone who is better than she. That is Vashti. So this brings us to chapter 2. Esther 2 and verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. So now the Bible here makes a reference to the wrath of the king. Now, I don't think that this wrath was actually directed at Vashti per se. I think it can be seen that way because of how close they are in the wording. But when we go back through history, and we're going to learn too also of the timing, this timing that we've been talking about, that there's this period between when the book of Esther starts and where things kind of pick up here in chapter 2. In fact, it's probably a whole 4 years now, give or take a little bit, since that event had happened. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it all falls into place with what we know in terms of history and what Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus, actually did, because it was in 481 to 479 BC, again, that he was making this war campaign against Greece. I want to say there was like 3 battles. One of them was the one at Thermopylae. Again, one of the famous ones, made famous by a couple of movies of 300 and 300 Spartans and things like that. But it wasn't very successful overall. But again, this wrath that he's talking about could very well refer to that, since we're talking about this 4-year span and this interim period of time and what was going on, that the wrath of the king could, I think, easily refer to what was going on in his battles against Greece. Because what we have is the 3rd year of his reign, beginning in verse 3, and then, as we'll see later on, it was the 7th year that's mentioned in this chapter. So I try not to get too far ahead, but I wanted to say that just to give this a certain amount of credence here. So it seems unlikely that he was mad for 4 years before he started doing all this with Vashti and looking for another who is better than she. Now, continuing on in verse 2, the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom," it's all 127, "that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, and to the women's quarters under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." And this thing pleased the king, and he did so. So here we have, he goes out, and his kingdom extends 1,000 miles this way, 1,000 miles this way. He's got 127 provinces, right? And he's going to go to all of them, and he's going to, summon these women, these virgins, to come to be his queen. Now, I'm not sure how much of a choice they had in the matter, or whether they thought this was actually a great opportunity, but nonetheless, he issues this decree, and so let it be done. Now, that being said, going to be the wife of the king, even if you're taken against your will, is not necessarily the best, or the worst of situations. And what we need to realize in all of this is that God is at work here, and that's what we need to continue to focus on. So continuing in verse 5, "In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite." So here we are, Mordecai, a Jew, and you're 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, and that's east of Jerusalem. And this was the nature of the diaspora at that time, as we're talking about. They went into captivity in Babylon, and not all of them went back. So they remained where they were, and in this case, they were near the capital of Shushan. Now, Cyrus, like I mentioned before, gave everybody the opportunity to go home, yet many of them didn't go home. They stayed there, and they made their homes there, and they became part of the empire, as it were. Now, they were seemingly content, and even to the point that they took local names here. And I'll get into that in just a second, about the name Mordecai and Esther. But just one point here that I wanted to bring out, and we'll have to develop it a little bit later and show you how it ties in as the story becomes more interesting. But it shows that he is this of the lineage of Kish, a Benjamite. Now, there's another son of Kish, and that was Saul. So we find that Saul and Mordecai were both from the same lineage. That would be Kish. So we will keep that in mind. Continuing in verse 6, it says, Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So Kish is a part of Benjamin, which was included in the southern kingdom of Judah. So when the Bible talks about Judah in terms of the southern kingdom, Benjamin is included in that. And so at the time of their captivity, which was sometime after the captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel, Benjamin went into captivity along with Judah. Excuse me. And so typically, as the nature was, the kingdom was named for the more prominent tribe. So continuing in verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. So Esther's other name is Hadassah, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So now we're introduced here to Esther, and we're given a little bit of background into who she is. Now, Mordecai raised her as a daughter, which again I think indicates a certain amount of age difference between the two, but nonetheless they were cousins. And again, because of this large age difference, it seems though that the relationship was more like father and daughter, and it was very evident that she was a young, lovely lady. Now, interestingly, as I was mentioning before, Mordecai and Esther are both Babylonian names. So Mordecai comes from Marduk, who was, I think he was kind of like the overall god of the Babylonian system, sort of like Zeus or Jupiter. And then, of course, Esther comes from Ishtar, which was, again, we know where we get the name Easter, and was another goddess in terms of who other people followed and lived and, again, infiltrated into our modern day system, so much so that we keep Easter as a whole, and again, as it's a pagan day that shouldn't be kept, but nonetheless, people are keeping that instead of the things that they should be keeping at that time of the year in terms of Passover and the days of unleavened bread. Now, this wasn't uncommon to have one of these names, and I kind of wonder how much of a problem it caused for them, or it should even cause for us, because you look at Joseph, who was in Egypt. He was given a different name by the king, and he went by that name. And then you look at Daniel, who we were talking about before. Daniel and his three buddies who were in, again, it's interesting, their names, their Hebrew names, I think at least I know, I know less well than their Hebrew names, but their buddies' names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these guys, that was their Babylonian name. So I think we do that a little bit today, even so. I know I'll make a call into a call center, and you have somebody with an accent, and they give you a name that is a name that you're familiar with. It's easier to remember, to write down, to know, because we're not familiar with perhaps the other names in other places and dialects. So I don't think it should be a big hang up. But one of the interesting things is that, of course, her name Hadassah meant myrtle. And that was the name that was given to her. And I don't know that there's any specific type of thing that we need to associate with that or glean from that. But nonetheless, it's mentioned one time and then that's it. And it's called the Book of Esther, and she is Esther. In Hebrew, though, Esther comes from the root word for hide or hid. And now that is somewhat more interesting when we consider the fact that God in this book is hidden by name anyway. And so it requires us to study and to go through this several times to see God in here, because he's not going to be so obvious in perhaps the first run through, or if you look at it with the wrong eye. So when we see this, so back to Esther 2 and verse 7, you have to begin to wonder just how far back God was working in their lives in terms of these two getting together and what God had purposed. Now, God may have seen them together and said, okay, here's what I'm going to do with them. Or he may have brought them together for a specific purpose. We can only wonder, but as we go through, he had a specific design, a specific purpose, and a specific plan in mind with them and their parts in this book, and we'll see this as we go along. So continuing in verse 8. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. So she was taken, and it doesn't appear that this was necessarily an invitation that was open to refusal. But nonetheless, that is not revealed to us, and so we have to just look at it and take it at face value and know, again, that God was in the picture. So continuing in verse 9, Esther 2, verse 9. Now the young woman pleased him. This is talking about Esther and the eunuch. And she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. So it looks like he gave her above and beyond what he had to or was supposed to. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. And he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. She was beautiful. And I would have to say she was beautiful inside and out. She immediately found favor with this the eunuch, and it seems as though she had already found favor with Mordecai, and no doubt with other people that she ran into. But it becomes immediately apparent that she is shown this chesed, that, again, we've talked about this, but this kindness, this mercy, this favor that is directed into her direction because of who and what she is. I mean, not only is she beautiful, but she acts in a way that's commensurate with that. And it's also, again, it's reminiscent of what we find in Ruth as well. Again, it was said of her using the same words about Ruth. And so this is no doubt an attribute and a characteristic of godly women. Continuing verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. So as we go through the verses, we continue to see that the why that something is done is not revealed. And I think that if it would have explained why he did something, why was it? I don't even want to throw something into your mind as to why Mordecai said that from the beginning. Okay, perhaps our focus would then be on Mordecai, on what exactly he said and what was going on, what his thoughts and what his plan was in terms of why he asked Esther not to do this. But as we will see, God had a specific reason in mind as to why he did not want Mordecai to mention this, or for Esther, or for him to say whatever, or why ever he said it to Esther, and why Esther was not to mention that she was a Jew. So our focus then should be then on this unseen hand of God in the picture. And again, it's helpful to know the end of the story, and I don't want to give too much away, but again, when we know where this is going, we see what God is doing. So if she had said that she was a Jew or a Jewess, then it is more than likely that the events that unfolded would not have happened in the way that they were going to happen had she told people that she was a Jew. And if I remember, I will try to bring that up at that salient point in time whenever it would have been, okay, see why she didn't do it, or why God didn't want it to happen at that time just yet. And specifically, obviously, I'm talking about Haman and Mordecai. So continuing on in verse 11. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So it was the women's quarters, and men were not allowed to go in there. In fact, there were some very specific rules as to where you could go and where you couldn't go. So much so that it did no good to pass in front, that there was nothing you could see from there or from anywhere else. So here he is, he's pacing back and forth, like a doting father or the caring guardian that he was. Verse 12, each woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying the women. Verse 13, thus prepared each young woman went into the king, each prepared woman went into the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's place. So whatever she thought she would get, or whatever she wanted to, do the best or make the best impression in front of the king, she could choose it. She could take whatever she wanted to gain the favor that I'm sure she hoped to gain. I mean, who didn't then, as a peasant or whatever these young virgins, whatever their lot in life was, they came here with the potential of being the new queen. So they were allowed to do whatever they want to make that first impression. In the evening, verse 14, she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. So he's kind of giving us the procedure for how things went and what each one was expected to do and could do to make that first impression on the king. And if it was not a good impression, then the king didn't call you back. No second audition, as it were. Verse 15. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So she deferred to Hagai's judgment. And again, I think that when you look at some of these women, again, I'm trying to imagine what they were doing, what they were thinking as they were all going in front of the king. And they say, okay, well, what can I do? It's almost like a talent show. And of course, this is not to demean women per se, even though this was perhaps a very demeaning process. But nonetheless, it was something that they wanted. I think a lot of them wanted to be queen as opposed to, the hard life perhaps of a peasant working the fields and whatnot. So here it is now, Esther's turn, and she's not going to put on airs. And she says, okay, well, whatever you think, Haggai, whatever you think I should do, I will do it. Of course, things like that are very endearing. So he was even more taken back with her, and she found more favor with him. So verse 16, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is of the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So this is where we get our time frame from. Here it is. It's the 3rd year of the reign is where we start. And here we are in the 7th year in the 10th month. And of course, we're told that in the 3rd year of the reign that they had a party for 6 months. So we're not exactly sure exactly what time it was. But again, we're talking somewhat ballpark figures. And of course, she went through her year of prettying up as well. And now we come to the 7th year and the 10th month. And again, this becomes significant a little bit later on. And so it's fairly well documented, these little chronological cues that the book of Esther gives us. And we're going to pull some more from this in another time. And it's not actually directly related to the reign, as it were, of King Ahasuerus. But there is going to still be more data that we're going to glean later on from yet another timestamp that is given to us in the reign of this king. So, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Just like that. Esther goes from being homeless, all right, she lost her mother and father, and Mordecai taking her in, so she's being raised by her older cousin, to being queen of a world-ruling empire. I mean, that's how God can work. And again, we're going to come back hopefully towards the end of the book, and we're going to draw some lessons from that. But one of the things I want to ask right now is, how did she do that? Again, you have to look at the situation and say, okay, think about it today. You want to go be the queen of Persia right now. You got no chance of doing something like that. You can't do that of your own power. Okay? It is only through God that these events could happen, could possibly happen. And we're going to continue to see this as we go along. So continuing now in verse 18, then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all of his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. So it seems like his wrath now is quenched, and he's back to having a good time like he had at the beginning of the book. Now, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. So now I think the more significant thing here is that Mordecai is now sitting within the king's gate. He's been promoted to a key position, and it really doesn't look like Esther had anything to do with it. So it's rather what we need to see is that God's hand is in this. And we'll see this here in the next verse or two, that God put him into a significant position for yet another reason, and it's a part of the puzzle that's being put together here. Verse 20, now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Now, it's still pretty clear that no one knows that Esther is a Jew, but that's not the case for Mordecai. So he's even called Mordecai the Jew. It is well known that he is a Jew. And had this situation been, had Esther told either one, that she was raised by Mordecai, or two, that she was a Jew, then there would have definitely been this association between she and Mordecai, as well as she and all the Jews. And the situation that is going to unfold here would not have happened in the way that it did. Now, continuing on, verses 21 through 23, in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, okay, this position of prominence, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers of the eunuch house, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So these two eunuchs were obviously not discreet in their anger or in their plans. And now, because Mordecai was in a position, a position that he wasn't in before, but now he had been promoted to within the king's gate, he became privy to the knowledge of these two that were not obviously very discreet about their feelings about the king, nor their plans. And so when Mordecai heard this, he acted appropriately, the way that he should have acted as a God-fearing person. Now, we don't yet know where things are in the story, if this is your first time. But yet this is another step in the process that God was working out. So when he told the king and it got back to the king, it was written, as it says, in the book of the Chronicles. So it's got a written word here, in the presence of the king. So all this was done with his knowledge. He knew of it. Mordecai literally saved his life. And nothing was done about that fact. And Mordecai didn't make a big deal about it, and Esther didn't make a big deal about it. No one said, hey, what's in it for me? I saved your life. Surely, you should do something. But they waited for the plan of God to unfold. And again, they enjoyed the positions that they were in. When I say that, they were content with the state that they found themselves in. And they left it at that. And they allowed God to work out what he was working out. So what we have here and what we're beginning to see is that even though God is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther at all, His unseen hand is working behind the scenes and is orchestrating the events in the lives of Esther and Mordecai, as well as other players that we're going to be introduced here later, as well as the whole nation of Judah that was within the Persian Empire. So those that had not gone back to Jerusalem. So a lot of this cannot be seen in the first run through. But as you go through it a second time and you know where it's coming, it becomes more and more evident that God is definitely working things out here in such a way. As I mentioned, again, what are the odds that Esther could become queen of Persia as a Jewess unless God's hand was in it? And as we go through it the second time, it becomes glaringly obvious. All right. Again, I keep talking for you as well. I'm hoping that you'll go ahead and read ahead and know for next time. So I suggest that you read ahead. It's not a long book. And after you do that, then we can pick up again at chapter 3.